I just have a few questions here. Is it possible that John had a copy of Mark with him
Yes.
when he? Okay, so is there any reason that we would be surprised if they didn't have kind of a roughly overlapping timeline? I mean, it seems to me that this is arguing that the story must be correct because this other story that someone wrote is consistent on these, like, this timeline, for example, of a few days, but that second writer had the first writer's book in front of him.
Yeah, it's
Why is that at all surprising, and how does that possibly get us even remotely close to the idea that the physical laws of the universe had to be suspended in order to have certain events happen? To me, those are on such different scales of evidence. Does that make sense?
the point isn't so much the consistency, but the subtlety and the casualness of the consistency. That's why it's called an undesigned coincidence.
Sure, but if they had, I mean, the thing is, like, these can happen accidentally if they happen to have the same sources and they're summarizing. They're going to drop out some details versus others, but they're going to keep the overall timeline. Let's imagine they were writing in perfect lockstep. They knew where Jesus was on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They've summarized because they have paper limits because paper's expensive and they want to make sure they get all the story in. These things are, I don't know, they're just not surprising. And this is the same thing happens, at least that I find, when people, and this is the few miracle claims that I've investigated, is that they make these claims that are really amazing, but then when you get to the evidence is pretty meager on the face of it. It's not the kind of level that you would expect. And this is before trying to even establish any kind of mechanism. So this kind of gets back to this kind of supernatural versus natural, causation. For me, when I hear about UFO claims or alien abductions or faith healings or whatever, the first thing I ask is there anything there? Like, is there just something to even investigate further? And is the level of evidence comparable to the claim that's being made? And these sorts of things that you're doing with the text, to me, don't sway me at all, because they wouldn't sway me in any other modern context. If someone were juggling around words and getting a timeline right, or this person left out this word and casually because and then this other person kind of filled it in, and between the two of them we get a complete story. That to me is just not nearly enough to convince me that someone's cancer was cured because of a certain agent outside of the earth. It's just, they're not the same level of evidence for things.
This isn't a miraculous claim. This is simply a mundane claim that Jesus arrived in Bethany 6 days before Passover, and then the following day he rides into Jerusalem.
Sure,
the only reason I brought that up was because you were contesting my argument on the basis that you think that the gospel authors utilize the Old Testament in causing the correspondence between Jesus' life and the Old Testament sources.
Yeah. I don't see how that addresses it. I mean, so maybe I can ask this question: when do you think the Gospel of John was written?
I'm not sure. I'm non-committal on that. Most scholars would date it to 90 to 95 AD. A minority of scholars, like Daniel Wallace, would date it to the 50s AD. And there's some arguments for dating it pre-70, like in John 5 verse 2, it says that there are colonnades by the sheep gate, and these, of course, were destroyed along with the rest of the temple in AD 70 by the Romans. So I'm non-committal on it.
Decades, we'll call it, because that subsumes all of them. And probably the same thing for Mark. Mark's a bit earlier, but again, we're talking 10 or more years. And so we don't have any writings from that kind of middle time, but I think the general assumption is that some kind of oral tradition is what kind of carried these stories between the time of the supposed events and the writing of the Gospels. Do I understand that correctly?
I think that the Gospel authors are close up to the facts, and that there's not a lot of oral tradition separating them from the events.
Yeah, but I'm sure there were some oral traditions that were around going along, and so they could have essentially shared sources, even if they're not written. They could be oral or whatever. This is why, like, I said that the Passover story is such a great story that you would. It seems perfectly reasonable to me that story would be consistent between the Gospels, even down to the timeline, if it was always told as like the story, right? And just like stories we might tell today, and one author might focus on one little bit and another little bit, but you are using this as a piece of evidence, kind of tying real events to the Passover, and I just don't see that. I see it as possibly constructed, which, of course, if it was constructed, based on Old Testament, then the Old Testament prophecies aren't convincing. So that's kind of the tie with in terms of kind of miraculous events.
Yeah, so if any listeners are interested in my interaction with the source theory, which could either be a written source or oral tradition from which both the gospel authors are drawing from, and how that intersects with the argument from undesigned coincidence, I actually wrote a 6-part series responding to Richard Carrier on this very point. But very briefly on this example, and people can find that at answeringmuslims.com. But very briefly on this particular example from John 12, these sources seem to be independent on this point. For instance, John alone tells us that they arrived in Bethany the night before, and it was in the morning that they get the colt. Mark telescopes, so he doesn't mention the fact he arrived in the morning, that they arrived in Bethany the night before, and in the morning he go to get the colt. Also in Mark 13, we're not told that it's actually evening time. It's inferred from the fact that the Mount of Olives is midway between Jerusalem and Bethany, where it's been staying for the night, which adds to the case for this being undesigned. Furthermore, in John chapter 12, we read about Jesus anointing at Bethany, which happens shortly after Jesus goes to Bethany, and then he's anointed while staying there. Whereas if you look at Mark's account in Mark chapter 14, he tells us that Jesus, or seems to suggest that Jesus is anointed in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper as he was climbing a table 2 days before Passover, not 6 days before Passover. And so there, at that point, you seem to have a discrepancy between John and Mark, suggesting that they're not actually, that these sources are actually independent of one another.
What's independence for you mean in this case?
John and Mark are not, John is not using Mark as a source on this particular point, and they're not using a common source.
Okay. And how do you distinguish between that and, because, on the one hand, you're saying that they overlap, but when they overlap and they've just dropped out different parts, then that's an undesigned coincidence. But then when they say something different, then that suggests that they're independent. Is that roughly how the argument goes?
Yeah, it's multifaceted. In this particular example, there seems to be a discrepancy between John and Mark as to when exactly Jesus was anointed at Bethany. That's between John 12 and Mark 14. And furthermore, we have to do some inferential work in determining that Mark 13, the Olivet Discourse of Mark 13 is probably in the evening, 3 days before Passover, because it doesn't actually tell us what time of day it is. It's inferred.
Again, it seems like you're using, that they could be using the same sources and possibly modifying a little bit independently, as storytellers will do, right? And so the undesigned coincidences, to me, they may be undesigned in the sense that they have the same source material and they're just dropping out different parts of it, and just focusing on one part versus another one seems to be like a trivial change to a story. The same thing for modifying some various details here and there. To me, these are and the fact that one has to go through and do this detective work shows that the evidence really is not that strong, and certainly not anything that for me anyway, would convince me of anything miraculous or even contribute to that. Every single one of these things seems to me like maybe it's unlikely, but far more likely than a miracle, but being the product of storytelling. And that to me is far more compelling, because we at least know that that's possible and that happens, and we have other examples of it. And so it's unlike the miraculous. So it seems, again, we're dealing with things with pretty moderate, prior probabilities, trying to raise the probability of miraculous events, prophecy, or these sorts of things. Just not particularly convincing. And it surprises me sometimes that people are convinced by the stories, right? And whenever I've heard you speak, and even in this episode, you'll confidently say about the visitations of Jesus and multisensory and things like that, as if like you're just buying the entire story. And there's nothing in the modern case that I could point to that I would have that attitude for. And I'm not sure whether there's anything that you would have that attitude for either. That somehow translating this back 2,000 years, if someone had to go through this kind of detective work for a medical paper in modern times, no one would be convinced by it. And yet it seems like people are convinced by it if you kind of make the case worse by throwing it 2,000 years ago and into anonymous sources that we have to kind of guess what their authorship is. None of the authors say who they are. We don't even know who they are.
Well, yeah, I think we can make a good
Or,
argument
yeah,
for
you
the
can make sure, you can make an argument for it. You have to actually try to infer who it is and who had which copy of what and so on. To me, that did not make a clear case, especially.
Although, I mean, the exception would be John, because I think that he does claim, I think that he at least claims to be the beloved disciple, and
I
I think
think
we
in
can.
one phrase that doesn't appear in all the old manuscripts, as far as from what I've read, and so it appears it may be an interpolation. Now, maybe not, but at least it's less clear than that. And he doesn't actually come out and actually say who I am. Even Luke, supposedly the really great historian, never says who he is. And he doesn't say who his sources are. And he doesn't say which ones are good, which sources are good, and which ones are bad, or any of that stuff that you would generally expect for history. Again, we have stories. And coming back, stories don't provide evidence for extreme things. We have stories of faith healings. We have stories of alien abductions. We have stories of UFO sightings. But what we lack are the things that would convince someone in a modern day that these things actually happened that are somehow extreme. I mean, not someone walking into a city, yeah, that's not that big of a deal. But like, someone rising from the dead, yeah, that we need a little bit more evidence for that. And I would think that you would as well.